Тож, пані та панове, нагадаю тему, чи стане політика перешкодою руху вперед, реформи в рік виборів. У нас друга частина, в якій приймають участь Макар, Paseniuk, керуючий партнер компанії ICU, Юлія Ковалів, голова Офісу Національної інвестиційної ради при президентові України, Ryad Yousuf, керуючий директор Goldman Sachs, Heemskerk, виконавчий директор Світового банку, Олена Voloshyna, голова українського представництва Міжнародної фінансової корпорації.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being very prompt, panel, so that we can whip through your opening statements. I think there will be quite a lot of discussion on this panel, so I'm going to ask you, with that in mind and the general requirement that we will all have to get to lunch, that you keep your opening comments to 5 minutes, no more. Could we start then? Let's go to the top end of the panel. Yuliya, from the National Investment Council, obviously investment is at the very heart of what you do. Could you just draw us a picture of where you are and where you think we should be focusing in this session?
Hello, everybody, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks a lot for both the ICU and Kyiv School of Economics for driving this kind of the dialogue here. And actually, of course, we are now actually benefiting from the 9 quarters of the economic growth. A lot of debates around the country before the elections, whether 3.2, 3.6% of GDP growth, it's enough, or whether we can get 9, 10, 15. And actually the history says, and the examples which were actually shown in the previous panel, evidence that the steadily but year-to-year economic growth, it's much better than these different figures starting from 1.2 up to 2015. And actually we see that the foreign investors are actually backing their views to Ukraine. If to compare with the 2015, even 2014, where the most efforts were driven just to hold those few investors which were in the country, for them not to close their business in Ukraine. Actually now we see a lot of different views of investors who are coming to Ukraine, and actually I think it's working somewhat like a chain reactions. The more success stories are happening here, the more good titles are around the news in Ukraine, the more companies are actually looking towards the Ukraine and trying to come here to explore the possibilities and opportunities there. And you know what strikes me when I met these people quite often now, and that's a good sign, that the one thing that most of them are saying that, look, Ukraine is under-advertised. You need to invest more in a good promotion, what is happening in Ukraine and what was already done for the last 4 years. Because there is a huge difference between what they read in the news, what they read in their reports, and what they see actually when they are spending a few days in the country, interviewing different stakeholders, and that's how the story change. And of course, I will come back to that success stories, because it's much easier for the companies to make a decision when they can present some of the peers having the success stories. You remember the big deal between the GE Transportation and the Ukrainian railways. It was a lot things to do and before the scheme to have this deal done, but just recently, 2 days ago, Alstom already signed an MOU for the further cooperation with Ukrzaliznytsia. That's how it works. You just create the market, you create a competition, and of course the companies are coming and looking. Another important thing that actually on the mapping of financial institutions, Ukraine is now not a part of the Russia. And Ukraine is now treated as a part of CE countries. And I think that is a great opportunity that we need also to explore. It's getting to the foreign capital and actually attracting more and more financial institutions with their development money to the economy of Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Olena, please take on your own thoughts. I'd love it, by the way, if you did pick up on that point made there of no longer being treated as part of Russia, but obviously still frozen conflict. It is still that Russian presence there in the Donbass and the questions over how long that is going to last and the terms on which that might change. That's something of the elephant in the room, I think, for a lot of investors wondering what the big situation will be for Ukraine. But so panel, could you just bear that in mind, please? Just weirdly, some people don't mention it until halfway through the day. Do go ahead.
I would actually pick up on what Yuliya just said. One thing not to forget is investors are human beings. After all, yes, we all read analytical reports. Yes, we all look at the country risk. Yes, those of us sitting in Hong Kong, London, or Washington are scared because of the conflict in the East, and it is not clear to us whether one can invest in Vinnytsia if we have a conflict in Donbass. So if there is a story, a positive story of a new investor which is coming, we should advertise it as much as possible because that generates interest from the investors. But even more important is an expansion or additional investment which is made by an investor who is already here. So these people that have invested in this country are our ambassadors. We need to treat them nicely. So if a large strategic investor has invested in an iron ore facility in Ukraine and cannot get access to railway wagons, that's a very bad story we're sending to the outside world. But if a large investor in agriculture, like Salik, is deciding to make an additional investment and acquire Mriya and help the financial investors that have already been in that transaction, that's a great story. That really needs to be advertised. Not only is Ukraine a place where you can make profit, but Ukraine is also a place where you can enforce. And there is a court system which is not perfect and can be criticized and improved, but it is functional. And Mriya case is really important from that perspective as well.
Okay, that's a particularly good time, I think, to turn to someone who can give the view of investors from outside the country. That's Ryad from Goldman's there. What do you think investors are seeing? What are they saying among themselves about Ukraine at the moment?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to this conference, and it's good to be here with the financial community in Ukraine. So I guess the investors have the opportunity to select where they're investing, right? So if they don't like
Could I just ask for a bit of quiet at the back? Sorry, Ryad, it's just a little bit hard. If you're intent on your other conversation, there are other bits of the hotel, but we'd rather you stayed here. Sorry.
So if they don't like what's happening here in the country, they'll simply divert their money elsewhere. So I guess the first thing that I would note is that and this is perhaps because of the presence of the IMF, there is a tremendous amount of two-way feedback happening between what the outside world wants to see in Ukraine and what the policymakers inside Ukraine are considering. So that this title of the forum that's talking about the reforms, the outside world, and I define that by investors, by the World Bank, the IFC, as well as the BRD. They're demanding certain things to change inside Ukraine. And if I hear the noise that's happening inside the country, I definitely see a reverse response to that request. And I think that's like fundamental. It goes down to the fundamental basics of what investors don't necessarily need to see a result straight away, but they really want to see a government that at least acknowledging that yes, these are issues, and we're looking to address them. I think I'll just point out another situation that's unfolding in Turkey at the moment, which really lays this to bear, because there you have a standoff between outside investors and the Turkish government. Effectively, the Turkish economy, very similar to Ukraine in the respect that it requires a lot of outside capital, is beholden to investors to pump in money every year. And investors are demanding a set of things to change, particularly prudent fiscal policy being kind of at the top of the list. And the government has a very different perspective of what that is. I guess the message is that if the country is reliant on outside capital, it cannot ignore the requests from the outside world. And to the extent that if you decide that those requests from the investors are not fair, not relevant, then you need to really think about what your country by itself can do, because you're going to have to say to outsiders, thanks very much, we got ourselves covered.
Okay, we might dive into what that means in practice in the next round, but let's get the World Bank view from Frank.
Well, thank you for having me here. My first message is that the glass in Ukraine definitely is half full. The government deserves a lot of credit for what they've done over the last couple of years, much more than in decades before. Question, of course, is how will that play out in elections? Well, Winston Churchill didn't run a campaign after he had won the Second World War, because he thought that the voters would reward him for that. And elections are never about the past, always about the future. So that's a bit of a sad thing for politicians, that you don't get a lot of votes for your track record, although it may help. The World Bank stepped in 2014 as the first IFI, and when President Jim Kim visited Kiev last year, he said it was the biggest bet we took, because we have confidence and we see the potential. However, the sad story is, and that's a quote from Nelson Mandela, he said that after climbing a great hill, one finds out that there are many more hills to climb. And that's also about the reforms. I mean, yes, the glass is half full. The government has done a great job, but you know, people are impatient and they need to do better. Finally, if you would have asked me before the summer, do you expect an incoming IMF mission in September? I would be hesitant. And also there, over the summer, a lot of positive things have happened. However, also here, the negotiations with the IMF, it's always about the last 5 minutes in any negotiations. And the World Bank and the EU will not provide additional financing without an agreement of the IMF. And with the large external financing need of the government, these are also very, let me put it diplomatic, very interesting times. But I'm more hopeful now than I was before.
I think when the World Bank says interesting times, people kind of close the front door. But again, so that was a little bit tempting. I'd like to come back to that. But Makar, I see you, and you've been involved so long in this process. You know, you've seen a lot of winds of change, you've seen a lot of improvement, and you've seen some setbacks close up. What do you think the outlook is now for investors, and where are you seeing real interest, real excitement and dynamism, and where would you like to see a little bit more focus?
Well, I'll start with saying that, and I've shared this view for a very long time. When you sit in this conference and listen to people talking about achievements and the results, it looks very different from what you read in the press. And you know, if you read the press and coverage of events in Ukraine, it's doom and gloom. But in reality, as far as our perception and feelings, things have been improving, and the government or the country has been successfully fighting the uphill battle. In terms of reforms in many sectors, and in terms of building sustainability, and it's difficult to comprehend. But you know, after the events of 2013-14, there was almost no country, and the economy, which all of us, you know, received, inherited, was not sustainable. And the reforms that people at the NBU, you know, other regulators have done, very unpopular, are very difficult to work. Shouldn't be underestimated, and especially given the fact that all of these reforms have encountered a number of vested interests that were against that. In terms of you know, investment views and what is interesting, what is not, Ukraine is a part of the global market, and just like everybody else or every other country, has to compete for capital. We heard from in the first panel that even China is trying to raise capital for its Silk Road project. Ukraine in a position where it just, reaching economic sustainability, but it has to offer something interesting to people to invest. And I would argue here that the role of the government in creating these opportunities is much more important than ever in other countries. Because the private sector, with where it is right now, with in terms of leverage, in terms of fragmentation, so on and so forth, cannot secure the meaningful level of investments to take the growth levels to the next level. And if you look at basics, then you will realize that investments, be it foreign direct investments or domestic investments, is the only realistic growth engine. So I would encourage the government to take a proactive role in creating investment projects, because at the moment, I would struggle to name an economically viable project where a private investor can put $1 billion. So, not to be abstract, I would say that I would single out agricultural sector, which already accounts for 15% of GDP, and the land reform, which we're discussing for a long time, would be that huge driver for the entire economy, for two reasons. It can be done very quickly in terms of attracting the FDIs, and it would be very meaningful. Just to give you some numbers, Ukraine has between 20 to 25 million hectares of agricultural land. 10 million of that is still owned by the state. The average rents are between $140, $150 per annum. Using even a cap rate of 10%, you arrive at an implied value of the land at $1,500. $1,500 per hectare, and this is very conservative. Times 10 million hectares, which are in state ownership, gives you 15 billion. 15 billion is comparable to what IMF has provided in the form of EFF facility. It's more than 2 times larger than the current net reserves of the National Bank of Ukraine. And what is more important is this 15 billion, or so, without counting all the wonderful things, additional follow-on investments, and so on and so forth, can be raised in 3 years or less.
Makar, can you just be precise towards the end about
what you
say with that, and then
the point is very simple. Ukraine needs investments. Unfortunately, private sector is not in a position to attract meaningful amount of these investments, and the state should help. And this is what is going to drive the growth. This is what will make Ukraine more sustainable. This is what is going to change the cost of funding. This is what will make Ukraine more independent from geopolitical point of view. And I would urge, the current government and the future governments to think very hard about not abstract things, but real things that can be done, which will lead to a noticeable change in a short period of time.
Thank you very much. Well, that gives us a sort of concrete example that we could maybe throw out to the rest of the panel. I mean, Ryad, listening to that, do you think, that's the kind of, exactly that big agriculture-based example there that Makar was laying out, that's the right direction, that's the prism through which investors might, warm up to Ukraine? Or do you think that is actually, just something that is just so ambitious and take years? If it ever happens, it'd be better off doing smaller steps?
No, I would actually echo Makar's comment to quite a few extent, but let me expand on the three types of investors that are present in Ukraine. And I think this segmentation is important just to explain, to come back to Makar's point. So there's basically a Eurobond investor, people who come and buy fixed income for Ukraine. There's the local currency investors, people who will come and invest into the UAH government bond market. And then there is the, what I would call FDI, or people investing into real assets in the country, so setting up factories, buying land, etc. The first category of investors are very fickle, the ficklest of the three, because they can easily exit within a moment's notice. And at a country like Ukraine, where your debt burden is so high, and the bond is a number 14 on the emerging markets bond index, you're very, very reliant on what's happening in emerging markets as a whole. So Ukraine could be the best country in the world, but given you're a part of the EMBI index, just the way people invest, stuff will go in and out that will be outside of Ukraine's control. So in a scenario where there's a global downturn in the emerging markets as a whole, people will just fly out of that bond, and which would be very difficult for the Ministry of Finance to refinance your debt. So that's category one. All this reform stuff we're talking about, they don't care. Like they really don't watch it. Land reform, corruption, they're not worried about it. They're just simply worried about what's emerging markets doing. So that's $14 billion. That's a lot. Second is the domestic market, domestic investment, domestic bond market, which in Ukraine is very, very small. The central bank is not here anymore, but a kudos to them, because the changes that they made in terms of liberalizing the currency market, going to an inflation targeting, and particularly listing the bonds in the clear stream was a massive step towards opening that market to foreign investors. So from Goldman Sachs, we can say that we're coming onshore to try to trade this bond and make markets, which really means that a lot of capital which could only invest into Ukraine in the bond market, the international bond market, will now look at this market as a way of getting in. And just to use a concrete example, Egypt, which did this process about 2-3 years ago, just from our hands, there was $20 billion worth of cash went into that market, which diversifies away from this fickle money that's in the Eurobonds into the local domestic market, which is a huge, huge boost. They also don't care about the reforms. This group of investors, they particularly care about the central bank and the Ministry of Finance activities. It's the last bucket, which is the third bucket, the foreign direct investment, where Makar's point comes into play, because there, Ukraine ultimately is a very, very large portion of the economy is agriculture. So people, when they think about investing into this country, they clearly are going to look at either commodities or agriculture or something else. And there, you have made some strides in the corruption side. So ease of doing business is an index that the World Bank puts together, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, Ukraine was 104 before, and the last couple of years they've come to 74. Now 74 is better, but there's some ways to go there on that front. So there's a few steps that I think the government is looking at to improve that. Land reform. I mean, if you're going to go into agriculture, clearly you have to enable the agricultural company to be able to raise credit. If the owner of the land cannot sell or pledge their land, the banks or international markets will not provide you credit. If you don't have credit, you will not invest into the agricultural sector. And if it's 15% of the GDP, that will be stuck at 15% of the GDP. So, and then there's a few others. So what I would say is that while the IMF is in town, because I think you've got hopefully 2 more years, and hopefully the political cycle allows the IMF to continue with this program, notwithstanding your concerns. It's the third bucket that the Ukrainian government really needs to think about and ask investors, and again, that dialogue is important. What do you need?
Great. Thank you very much for that. Let's go back to Yuliya. There are quite a lot of challenges there, really. I mean, from those representing the government today, we've heard things are going in the right direction if only we could get the message out there. But I think Ryad was saying something much more still had to happen. I mean, land reform, I seem to have been talking about ever since I first covered this country after the collapse of communism. So do you need to look more closely at your own sort of model and your own priorities?
So one more thing, I fully here support what Makar was telling about the land reform and some of the involvement of the government in order to secure the foreign direct investment, the strategic investors coming to Ukraine. And there are some other sectors that have a huge opportunity and in the same time a huge threat. I'll just put an example as the infrastructure. We definitely need billions of dollars investment into infrastructure because the fully depreciated infrastructure gives already a signs like the Arcelor a few days ago mentioned, and it's actually now even hurts the exports, hurts a lot of exporters and the economy because the bottlenecks of the infrastructure cannot be solved within the public sector and within the state-owned companies because actually lack of capacity, lack of resources, lack of even physical experience on how to do it, how to make a turnaround of those big, not only the companies but the industries. And just attracting the private capital to that sector is a crucial one. And the forms of PPP, the forms of concession could be a good way into creating and bringing the foreign direct investment, bringing the strategic investors into that huge of sectors. And I'd say that we see an appetite of the investors in that kind of the investments. And here the homework needs to be done, the legislation needs to be in place, and also some of the few pilots need to be done successfully in order to bring the trust of that kind of the instruments in Ukraine. Of course, the doing business is still something the easiest every of the investor is looking on. 76 is somewhere in the middle, so the glass is half full, but still I think that the good ideas and the good intentions of the government to be in top 50, top 20 is the thing that need to move on. And the third very important thing is actually what a lot of investors are now coming to Ukraine and asking is about the implementation of a lot of reforms that were already voted in the form of the law in the parliament, done as the government decree. But there is still not much of the good track record of the implementation of the reform. And it's, I think, the harder thing, because all of them want to have a practical evidence that all of this legislation is working here. As soon as they get this evidence, there is much more comfort for them to enter.
Thank you very much. I mean, Olena, on that point, evidence, yes, but in order to have evidence on really sweeping changes, you need to stop having moratoriums as part of the discussion in politics or the fundamental stance of the politics towards land reform. Am I right?
You're absolutely right, and I'm completely echoing what Makar said and Yuliya and Ryan. We are an interesting animal. In your third batch, we are a small group because we are an investor that is investing for profit, but we're also a developmental institution being part of the World Bank. So for us, the agenda is twofold. We need to make a profitable investment, but the mandate is to demonstrate through that investment that the private sector can operate and also to have an impact on the sector and on the economy in general. So I would summarize it where I see the government role is the government should create assets for investors like us or strategic investors to invest. And this could be through privatization, where there could be an interest by investors, through concessions, and that's why the law is needed. But where land reform comes into play, because it also addresses my first point that I made in my original comment, that's going to be a very positive signal that Ukraine is going to be sending to the outside world. We're finally removing the moratorium. We're opening up. Yes, it's been a difficult one, but this time we're serious, so that the story component for me is important as well.
Frank, does that reflect reality as you see it? I know the World Bank has been very active for a long time back in advocating for this, but there's still talk about extending the moratorium to 2024. It doesn't seem to have completely left the debate here in Ukraine. I mean, practically, how much further on do you think we are?
Well, our role, of course, on the one hand, we're the World Bank. On the other hand, we're a small bank. And we have limited impact because we can only be successful if there's a political will in the country itself. And then our role as a bank is that we bring three components to the table. Financing, knowledge, and trust. and knowledge of, let's say, land reform, how it has been done in other countries in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Trust, because it can be done, and you can learn from other countries, and we've made mistakes, and we're willing to share these mistakes. And I think that technical work is crucial, I think, for all three groups of investors, not only for the foreign direct investors, but it will take time, and it's only possible if there's political will, and then we have a lot of evidence how it has been done in other countries and how it can be done here. And let me allow to make one more point from World Bank perspective. Yes, growth is important, and technical reforms for growth is important, but please make sure that it is inclusive growth, because those countries that continue to focus on those groups that do not particularly profit from the growth, but that includes the bottom 40%, which is a target of the bank, those countries are on the long run better performers. So yes, also invest in education, early childhood education, women, financial inclusion, because if you don't pull all the groups into the equation, sustainable on the long run.
Makar, quick word from you on that, or anything you've heard, and then any questions.
Well, I think the key is to identify real big projects and drive them. I fully agree with everything that my colleagues have said, so we'll not be wasting anybody's time.
Right, that was short and sweet. Right, how's the audience feeling? Do you feel that we've got to do all the work, or do you fancy doing some? There we go, we've got a hand up there. Let's hear your question. Can you get a microphone over to this end? Thank you. Is anyone else? Do stick your hand up, because then someone in the front, yes, I know you. So first here, and then the gentleman in the front.
So is it switched on? Yes. Yuri Bender from the FT group, and I would like to ask our panel, we've heard about reforms, we've heard about big investment projects. Unfortunately, we cannot change the noisy neighbors to the east. We can't change their mentality, we can't change their ambitions. Olena Voloshyna acknowledged this fact earlier on, mentioning the very hot conflict which is going on in Donbass, where Ukrainian soldiers are dying every week protecting their territorial integrity from the Russian aggressor and their local proxies. Now, as the election approaches, various parties are talking about a reintegration of Donbass after the elections and talks with Russia. Those talks would involve inevitably some sort of concession to Vladimir Putin in terms of Ukraine's path to European integration. I would love to hear the opinion of the panelists. What would be the attitude of foreign investors to a country which was at peace, but was perhaps sacrificing some of the European integration process and reform that's recently been made?
Very good question. I think gets to the heart of something that we need to address. Who would like to go first on that? That's a fantastically interesting mixture of geopolitics, security, and views of investors. So, yeah, no problem there. Who'd like to have a go at that one? See how popular that question was.
I think I think Ryad should start. It would be a good place to start.
After you,
I saw that coming, Makar. Thank you. Look, I'm not going to comment on the politics because it's not my area of specialty, so I can't really comment on that. But I guess I'll just make some observations on how the outside world will look at this. People definitely want a stable Ukraine. So it's not good to have a war in the east. It's not good to have a war at all. So the first comment is that if there is any compromise whatsoever, that takes the war off the table, would be clearly a positive for Ukraine. Now, if that comes at a concession where outside investors are, prohibited in terms of being able to make those investments into a country, because remember, in my 3 buckets of investments, once the World Bank is once the IMF is gone out of town in a couple of years, the only thing to rely on to service these debt and money into the country will be the 3rd bucket, like how much investment has been made into the country. And all the reforms and etc. that we're talking about is really to prepare the country on a post-IMF world such that it can sustain itself in terms of its debt, but also its progress. So if the concessions that you pointed out in any way hampers that growth or hampers that investment environment, then you're back to square one, because obviously you cannot have the IMF in town forever, and you still have a lot of debt to contend with, and your country will be reliant on foreign capital for a while.
Yuliya, that's a very difficult question. It's a question people in Ukraine would wish they didn't have to contend with it, but may nonetheless be a decisive one, which is, do you in the end have to make some sort of trade for the reintegration of Donbass against European integration and the westward-leaning instincts, particularly that we've seen in the last few years? What do you think?
It's really a hard question, and I think from the outside perspective, we already heard that, of course, any kind of the peaceful solution for the Donbass is a kind of the good signal, and of course, for investors, it eliminates one of the risks, and it's of course a positive thing. But I think it also, in a long-term view, it's also important to, and we see it, and Metro already quoted the pulse of the Ukrainians supporting the EU integration, supporting NATO, and it's already increased for the last 4 years significantly. And of course, it's also in order to proceed with reforms, in order to encourage the government, and also being this reform popular among the Ukrainian population, the EU integration and this wish of Ukrainian people need to be taken into account. Because one thing that actually we did not discuss here, the thing is about the unpopularity of some of the needed reforms that are being taken into the country, and the land reform is, by the way, one of the good examples. The second thing is privatization. You need to make those changes, you need to make those reforms also popular within the population of Ukraine, to make them much harder to reverse back. And that is also comes to EU integration. The more people now share the views of integrating Ukraine into the European community, more to the security with NATO, I think that needs to be definitely a huge thing to consider for any of the discussion into the concession and peaceful solution for the situation on the East.
Frank, first the question of the noisy neighbour, and then that very good point actually from Yuliya. We're often places like this in a setting where people welcome reforms. That's, one doesn't have to go very far outside the building, let alone to other parts of the country, to find the public are much more sceptical about this direction of reform. What's your take?
Yeah, so reforms can pay off, they can be inclusive, they can create jobs and growth. And in the past, maybe we have oversold the success of the reforms, but there's lots of evidence from other countries. On the question on the peace, it's a bit of a leading question, actually. And of course, you make peace with your enemies. You don't make peace with your friends. And of course, investors are happy with more stability and peace. But I think that a lot of investors also care about integrity of borders and not a reward to aggression. So let's also bring that into the equation.
Anyone else like a word on that, or shall we go back? I think this gentleman had a question at the front. Would you still like your question? So if it's, can I have this sprint record broken here for Ukraine? Yeah, brilliant, thank you.
Yeah, good day. My name is Andrew Blinov. I'm the financial macroeconomic analyst, and some of you might know me as a radio show presenter. Well, my question is about the factor which has already been discussed here at UFF for several years, but all of you is not seeing about this. That's the issue of some governmental bodies like security service and military prosecution and some others which are raiding the business, and no one of you had said this. Does it mean that it is not anymore the factor of the barrier towards the FDI to Ukraine?
Who are you directing your question to? So I generally,
Well, just,
anyone,
Everybody are the investors here.
any of the right.
Okay, I then maybe will start on this, because if to compare actually to the autumn of last year, this was one of the hottest topic and one of the hottest issue where not only the foreign but the local companies were suffering with. And actually, when the situation was rather problematic with that issue, if you remember, the government very quickly and the parliament approved it, I think, in 2 weeks. The legislation, the restriction were significantly improved, and we now see that these cases still happen, but I think that the situation is improved, and we are now monitoring closely with the biggest business association working with both the foreign companies and Ukrainian companies, and I think that situation improved a bit. Of course, the law enforcement agencies are still an issue, and I think it's not only for them. It's maybe even from my previous experience of the government, it's a view of a lot of bureaucrats and the people who are working in so-called system for the 10, 15, 20 years, and they have a very specific understanding of what is the interest for the state. Because all of them think that the interest for the state, for example, is only the revenues to the budget. But when it comes to destroying the new employment, destroying the businesses, and so on with such kind of the actions, they think it's okay because they underpaid 1 hryvnia or 200 hryvnias to the budget. The thing is into bringing the different mentality and to full reload of this kind of the agencies with the new people. And that's why the part of the reform of the civil servants, the public sector reform, is important to change this Soviet mind where a lot of people still have this.
Anyone else like to comment on that question? Anyone with particular interest? Olena.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Yuliya was saying. This is actually one of the reforms that is long overdue, the reform of the public sector. That's going to be cross-cutting, because what we have is still the old Soviet system, Soviet mindset in the heads of our bureaucrats. It's about control. It's not about servicing the business. It's not about servicing the people. It's about controlling, telling them what to do, and that is often used for raidership. Although what I'm hearing from my clients, to answer to your question, is that the situation has gotten better, especially if you are running a transparent business and do everything right, then the chances of being raided are much less than if you're in the shadow.
Right, so assuming that it's quite clear where the shadow and the light begins. Right. Now, I think we've got very few last minutes. I'd like to go once quickly around the panel, but is there any question this side of the room that anyone would like to ask? Or do all the extroverts live on this side of the room? Nothing absolutely burning that you'd like to ask. Right, in that case, I think we'll just go once back past the panel this way. I asked a question at the start of the morning, which I think is quite a nice one to end with. One thing you would do and one thing you wouldn't do to take Ukraine forward with the views of investors and the interests of investors in mind. Obviously, it's a short fire panel, so make it a haiku, please. Makar, what would you do, not do?
For all types, for all 3 buckets, or for any particular one?
Choose a bucket. No, I don't think you can go through all the buckets, otherwise we'll be here all day. But just choose a priority, really. One thing you do, one thing you wouldn't.
I wouldn't vote for populists, and I wouldn't promise lowering interest rates.
Ah, right. They were nice and pithy. There you go. Thank you very much. Frank, you'll do and not do.
I would do is have an agreement with the IMF, because then the EU and the World Bank will follow. And not do is don't think that voters are stupid. Voters are very, very smart. So be honest in what you've done, be honest what you can achieve the years to come, and that's the only way to create more credibility towards the government, and then the government can deliver.
Thank you very much. Ryad, you're going to give your takeaway.
I'm going to have a very hard one, so let me just throw it out there. The Ukrainian government, currently the way it works is the presidential power really only relies on foreign policy and security matters. And the parliament looks after the cabinet. And if you actually read the letter that's been sent to Ms. Lagarde about the IMF program, the people who are signatories of that letter are actually not the ones who are passing most of those reforms. So I think that puts a very difficult situation about how the government is set up, and I think ultimately it's up to the Ukrainian people. But having this polling system on the presidential side, where right now there's only 10% support, or roughly 10% support for each one of the candidates, and ultimately the powers is a very, very fractious parliament. In the long run, that will pose difficulties in terms of passing policies, passing reforms, and having an agenda that's for the national interest. So that's something to, I would say, consider. Obviously, I'm not saying to change it, but it's something to consider. One thing I wouldn't do is take away the central bank independence. I mean, I think Ukraine has fought long and hard to gain that. Please keep that. That's very, very important.
Great, nice and clear. Thank you. Olena.
I would do one good privatization case, again, to show the world that we can do it, bring in a good strategic investor. And what I wouldn't do is I would not extend the land moratorium.
Thank you very much. I like this round. People really have to come down to their one thing. It's like you get, your one and only personal bucket. Yuliya, what's in yours?
I think that what I do is something close to what Lena said. I'm a big fan of concession, and I still believe that a good case on concession of the big, what is called the strategic assets of Ukraine could be a good success story, solving a lot of infrastructure problems. What I would not do, I would not overpromise any of the things, because I think the biggest problem for the reality now is these overpromises and too high expectation of the 4 years of the reforms and the outcomes. There is still a lot of people who believe that in 3-4 years in the country of Ukraine, in the war, in the conflict, all of the things can be fixed, whether it's physically impossible. And that, I think, gives a lot of extended challenges to the current situation inside the country.
Which takes us back to one of our earlier panels on how the politics plays into this, everywhere, of course, but with perhaps a particular intensity in emerging markets at the moment. Well, that ends this panel, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for appearing in such numbers. And I know it's a long morning, but I think we got incredibly good value from both of our last panelists, and everyone who appeared on them. Lunchtime now. Feel free, obviously, to enjoy and mingle with that. But if you could be back for the start of the session after lunch, we'll be delving deeper into the energy sector and how that might go forward. But enjoy your break and give them a round of applause.
Тож, пані та панове, запрошуємо вас на обідню перерву до ресторану готелю «Брістоль». І будемо чекати на ваше повернення о 14:15, для того, щоб ви прийняли участь у продовженні форуму. О 14:15 починається промова ключового спікера. Це Едвард Лукас, старший віце-президент Центру європейського стратегічного аналізу, колишній головний редактор The Economist. Його тема – це змінюючі підходи в енергетичному секторі України.